morning, good evening, good afternoon. Welcome back, everybody, to the channel. I, as always, am your host, Magsy. Let's talk about stuff. And the stuff that we will be talking about today is, of course, the fourth tier of the Spider-Man iceberg. In the last episode, we talked about a wonderful variety of things, such as James Cameron Spider-Man, Michael Jackson Spider-Man, and other things as well. We are now on the fourth tier of the iceberg, meaning that we're about halfway through it all, through all the tiers, which is exciting. That's a word for it. There's a lot that can be said, there's a lot that will be said about this tier. Let's just get right into it. Starting with Kraven's Last Hunt. Now, while the topic itself may not be the story, it is still important to at least understand the bare bones of what it is because of the actual fun facts that we're going to be talking about. So, in the nuttiest of nutshells, Kraven's Last Hunt is the story of Kraven the Hunter incapacitating Spider-Man, burying him alive, like headstone and everything. And then while Spider-Man is incapacitated, Kraven, gets his, rusty, trusty hunting rifle and goes on a vigilante spree. All in a bid to prove to himself that if he wanted to be, he could be like a better Spider-Man than Spider-Man. Trust me, my dad told me, that kind of energy. And when he does eventually like prove to himself I was right, how do I say this? He finishes the hunt. He turns his hunting apparatus to himself and finishes the hunt. Which, having a villain bury the superhero alive and then having the superhero have to quite literally dig himself out of his own grave, which is like the iconic panel that came from the story. Masquerade as that superhero that is currently 6 feet underground in just a pine box, go on a killing spree only to end that spree with yourself, may not sound exactly what you'd expect from a Spider-Man story. Very dark, very gritty, not what you'd expect from the good old red and blue wall-crawling son of a gun, right? This sounds like the story of a different character. This may sound like the story of a different character, which that would actually be some good instincts on you, because this was actually written for a different character, which your instincts are good on that because this was actually written for a couple of different characters before it landed on Spider-Man. If we're splitting hairs, Joe DeMatteis initially wrote what would end up becoming Kraven's Last Hunt for an obscure, or at least more obscure than Spider-Man, Marvel character by the name of Power Man, who, if I'm remembering this correctly, Power Man was like the first comic book hero, or at least for Marvel Comics, the first character to like experience reincarnation, something like that. But Marvel passed on that. So then the writer, J.M. DeMatteis. But after Marvel passed on the story for Power Man, J.M. DeMatteis, the author of the story, went to DC to pitch it, but a little different. Obviously with different characters in mind. In this case, it was going to be Batman who gets buried by the Joker. And in the initial pitch, it was going to be that Joker buries Batman, and then Batman's underground for a couple days, quite literally. But as time progresses, Joker no longer has, like, the center, like the fuel rod of his obsession to be insane and to be a criminal. So he slowly becomes more and more sane over time, which was interesting enough for that story to be kind of explored later on in a different comic. However, at the time, DC passed on the idea mainly because they were already working on the Killing Joke, so they probably didn't want to have two different Joker-centric stories competing with one another. But DeMatteis didn't let that slow him down, he just repitched it with a different character in mind. Instead of it being the Joker who buries Batman, it would be Hugo Strange, and the motivation for Strange to do this would be to prove that he could be the better Batman if he wanted to be. We're seeing the puzzle pieces coming together, aren't we? Of course, DC passed on this pitch as well, and everybody passed on it except DeMatteis, who gave himself permission to make the story after he got hired as the main writer for Spider-Man. Independent of all of this, DeMatteis just gets hired. Hey, do you want to do Spider-Man stuff? Sure, I would love that. That sounds great. And even though he had never thought about Spider-Man in this story, he still saw this as the perfect opportunity to just get this story out there. He'd been working on it for months, maybe even years. He now has the authority to have this release at all, he might as well take it. And while he initially was just going to write in an entirely new villain to do the whole, bury Spider Man alive thing, he quickly changed gears when he started doing his homework and was reading through the Marvel Handbook when he came across the page about Kraven the Hunter. And it's here that he learned that Kraven the Hunter's full surname is Sergei Kravenov, and of course that he was Russian. And it just so happened that DeMatteis was a fan of Dostoevsky, a Russian author, and his exploration of the duality of existence and the depths of the human heart. And if he was setting out to find or make depth in Kraven's character, he certainly accomplished that. Before Kraven's Last Hunt, Kraven was a bit character. He was a villain of the week that Spider-Man would occasionally have to deal with. Simply just a mad, rich Russian who is so bored with his wealth that he decides, I'm gonna make big game hunting my whole personality. But DeMatteis single-handedly, with Kraven's Last Hunt, injected all this depth and nuance and psychological complexity that wasn't there before, and completely redefined and recontextualized the entire character. And we can see the end result of this shift in character most in Insomniac's Spider-Man 2. Because in Spider-Man 2, spoilers by the way, they essentially loosely adapt the Last Hunt storyline. Except in this case, it wasn't Kraven trying to prove that he was the best Spider-Man, it was him trying to intentionally die in the heat of battle. Because loosely paraphrasing actual dialogue from Kraven in that game, he would much rather die, like, fighting and bleeding and dying, like, in the wild than he would dying peacefully and quietly in a hospital bed. Again, instilling that, like, depth and nuance and, like, unorthodox mindset in everything. And to put a neat little bow on this topic, before going on to the next one, let's also shout out DeMatteis for his perseverance. He pitched this story for like 3 different characters, at least 4 or 5 different times, and never got an approval, never got like, hey, that sounds like a great idea, let's print it. And then he just did it himself when he had the first chance to do so. He didn't care that it wasn't going off of the perceived norm of Spider-Man. He just saw this as his opportunity to make a story, and he did, and everybody liked it. Despite being markedly more gritty and psychological and darker than most Spider-Man stories at the time, it's still seen as one of the most popular ones. Probably in spirit of being so, like, contrastingly different from other Spider-Man stories, especially, again, at its time. So yeah, never give up on yourself, follow your dreams or whatever. Good job, DeMatteis. Iron Man in Web of Shadows. Spider-Man Web of Shadows is a video game about Spider-Man and, like, a symbiote invasion. There's a lot of crossover characters. Like, one of the bosses is straight up just a Venomized Wolverine, but he does not make a significant, influential appearance. I think it's explained like he's away from New York and is occupied with something else. Who knows? But yeah, he's just out of commission, but he still exists within the universe of Web of Shadows, if anything. So yeah, it's more of a brief topic, but still a topic nonetheless. Okay, so thinking about my other stuff, I cannot for the life of me remember if I had mentioned this before, if I have mentioned this, but let's talk about Sam Raimi's Venom for a moment. Because Sam Raimi fully admits that Venom in Spider-Man 3 was a bad idea, but also that it wasn't his idea. It was actually the idea of producer Avi Arad, who insisted, hey, Venom's a popular Spider-Man character, we're making the popular Spider-Man movies, let's put Venom in Spider-Man 3, despite the fact that it was nowhere in Raimi's vision for what the story was going to be. And Raimi has been fully open and honest about the fact that he does not understand, like, the humanity of the character. He, just didn't have a good understanding of what that character was supposed to be, especially not good enough to adequately feature him in the movie. Or in his vision of a movie, to be more precise. But of course, there is a hierarchy on set, and producers are above directors. So with Avi Art's insistence, Raimi eventually had to put him in the movie. To which, to be fair, Avi Art has admitted and has taken responsibility that Venom was his idea, and that any negative effects on the success of the film because of Venom is his responsibility. So at least there's that. And at the very least, to understand Ard better, adding Venom was absolutely a business decision. It's branching out for franchising because, of course, there were plans on a spin off Venom movie in the Raimi verse. Of course, that was before Raimi stepped down from Spider Man 4, and then that franchise just kind of had to die down because, I don't know, the director who made it all real and come to life was no longer working on it. But they did have plans for a Venom story, and they gotten to the point of doing some writing for it before Spider-Man 4 fell through, and then the rest of the everything fell through as well. With the minimal writing that was done and what we know about it, there was going to be a sort of transition or a change of the character. So instead of Venom being a straight up villain, he was going to take on more of an anti hero role, which is comic accurate. I mean, in the comics, Venom does eventually go off to San Francisco and become the lethal defender. However, what I would be more fascinated in is how they explain the end of Spider Man 3. Both the symbiote and Eddie Brock were seemingly vaporized by a goblin bomb, so it'd be interesting to see that continuation of the story if it seemed like a pretty concrete end in Spider Man 3. And this was way before, multiverse stuff or time travel stuff that, being objective, give superhero movies kind of an out with continuity. I'm just saying. So it'll be interesting to see how they would basically explain away death in an otherwise, you know, relatively grounded superhero story. And actually, speaking of Spider Man 3, let's talk about the deleted scenes. Now, deleted scenes are nothing new for a movie. Every movie has one. That's not necessarily unique. But there are a couple of things from the, like, roughly 20-30 minutes of public footage or deleted scene footage that we have. And while that isn't necessarily unique, there are a couple of things that I would like to touch on in regards to the roughly 20-30 minutes of deleted scenes content that is public. First of all, the alternative final fight between Spider-Man and Venom. I would just like to point out that somebody took all the materials they could find, including the novelization of Spider-Man 3, used all of the accompanying visual materials, deleted scene materials, of course, and then literally drawing storyboard panels of all the pieces that were missing to essentially reconstruct the full final fight. And the other thing I'd like to talk about is the deleted scenes for Sandman, specifically because of what I said before. Because just a minute ago, I explained how Sam Raimi kind of had to shoehorn in a character based off of the producer's wishes, and how that went against his original vision. The original vision was going to be, Spider-Man versus Sandman versus Hobgoblin, Harry Osborn. But then came Venom, and then them having to shoehorn in not just a new character, Eddie Brock, but also the whole Bully Maguire storyline. And that could have been time used to flesh out other characters, specifically Flint Marcos. A lot of the content that we have is based around Sandman. There's panning shots of the lab or the control center of the experiment that turned him into Sandman, as well as different shots and different scenes that are related to his daughter. Because when I think back on Spider-Man 3, it does kind of seem like a loose thread. Flint Marco escapes prison, literally builds himself back up to see his daughter, and then he robs a bank, teams up with Venom, and then he disappears into a cloud. It's hard to remember the family aspect of Flint's story, which is a shame because my favorite deleted scene was Flint Marco's daughter and her mother sitting in a park seemingly waiting for Flint Marco, but he's nowhere to be found. He's not showing up. It almost feels like a sort of hard learning moment for his daughter that because of his past actions and his current predicament, being made of sand, being a fugitive, escaped convict, everything, that he may not be the most reliable father figure for her to have. But as they're packing up and as they're like getting ready to leave the park, his daughter notices. I'm looking up her name. Penny. It's Penny in Spider-Man 3. It's also Kimia in the comics, but we're going with Penny because that's on the wiki. Penny is getting ready to leave and she spots a giant sandcastle. I know what you're thinking, it's made of sand, but no. Flint Marko did not make the sandcastle for his daughter. He is the sandcastle. He constructs himself up to be this beautiful sandcastle to amaze his daughter and to like have like the little hand imprint at the door to signify to her that while he may not be able to be there like a regular father can, he's still there for her, which I just think is very sweet. And I like it when sympathetic villains have those kinds of touching, humanizing moments. Let's talk about Jack Kirby. Now, initially, well, let me get my material set up. Now, initially with this topic, I thought it was pretty cut and dry. However, thanks to Matt's media reviews, I know better now. Also, thank you, Mr. Media Reviews, for the kind comment that you left under the previous iceberg video. So, thank you. But it was also thanks to watching a couple of his videos that I learned that there actually was like a big overarching drama around Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, and Spider-Man and everything. So for the very little that I know about this whole story, and there are videos and everything that explain it better, Jack Kirby had alleged that before Stan Lee worked with Steve Ditko on the Spider-Man design and art and all that kind of stuff, Stan Lee had approached Kirby about designing something for Spider-Man. And while the internet is filled with stuff that is allegedly the quote-unquote original design for Spider-Man that was drawn by Jack Kirby, none of them have been verified, and a lot of them do sort of recycle poses from other like instances of Jack Kirby's artwork. So you can't trust anything on the internet. It doesn't exist. Right? There's no confirmed existence of this original sketch or these original designs. And again, from what I can recall, this was a huge overarching thing. It was a huge drama between Kirby and Ditko and everybody. I think there's been videos, maybe documentaries, written about it. I think everybody involved is dead now, so who knows what actually happened, But yeah, the big thing that I have written down was Kirby kind of like used this to claim that he created Spider-Man, which even if that is true, even if, Stan Lee approached Jack Kirby first and said, hey, I've got this idea for this spider guy, right? Could you do a little quick sketch? I'll talk a little bit about him. Even if that is true, and even if Jack Kirby, after that conversation, made a design for Spider-Man, Stan Lee still premiered it with Steve Ditko's design, which means that if this is true, Stan Lee saw what Jack Kirby did, personally felt like it was not part of his vision, and then went to another artist that he was working with, because I think everybody was working at Marvel at this time, and he went to Steve, and Steve gave his own design, and Stan Lee preferred that one, so he went with that one. Who knows? Maybe Jack Kirby did create Spider-Man. The original concept art for the black-suited Spider-Man is interesting, because A, of course, it's historical material, because it's the original design of the suit, but also because it has one big key difference in that in the original design, instead of it being white accents, so like white eyes and a white spider emblem, it was all red, which would be referenced decades later in Spider-Man 2, because one of the unique styles that you can get for the symbiote suits is with a red emblem. And if you're a big comic fan, it just so happens that black and red is also the general color style for Carnage, as well as for Null, who is for a while was like the god of symbiotes. But also, to be fair, red and black is a popular color scheme, so it's not like they were the only ones to ever do it. Like, it was hardly the first ever instance of a Marvel character, let alone a character, having a red and black design. It's just, I find it interesting. These are parallels I've made. I've connected the dots. I find them fascinating. There's also a nifty little diagram showing how like the web shooter would work, which I don't know why. I'm just a sucker for concept art that has like little practical notes like that. Speaking of concepts, actually calling back to Ditko, let's talk about Green Goblin for a second. Because in the initial idea for the Green Goblin, Stan Lee, the guy who created the Green Goblin, initially envisioned like a movie crew finding this sarcophagus, let like they open it to find out it contains like an actual ancient demon, and then that was the Green Goblin. And then either it would just be like a demon that's just out and about, or it's like a goblin that possesses a person, and then they become like a host for the goblin, and then they like goblin all over the place. However, Steve Ditko, who has mainly at this point taken more of like an art style direction, like he was the one in charge of the artistic vision of Spider-Man. He's the guy who designed the suit. Even still, he heard Stan Lee say, like, I got this idea for a demon, right? And he was the one who took charge and said, hey, that's a great idea. Maybe for the Spider-Man guy, it's just a dude in a suit. Like, maybe he has, like, he's a crazy guy. Maybe he's a powerful crazy guy, but he's still just a dude in a suit. Like, that would be, let's try working on that angle. And then they did, and then they made art. And then they made, like, Spider-Man's true arch nemesis, like Spider-Man's Joker. Perfect. Which I do personally think that tidbit should be respected as the sort of like the lesson in how important it is to have a team, especially in a creative endeavor. Also, the importance of listening to that team. Like, Stan Lee could have just been like, well, you're not the guy who made Spider-Man, huh? I did, so I think I know what I'm doing. And then we would have gotten a demon. But thanks to the trust between Stan and Ditko, Ditko felt comfortable in saying, hey, I think you should go this direction with this character. And Stan listened, and we all profited from it. So teamwork. The light. The Spider-Man Trading Studio was a cassette tape, like an exercise workout video, that was made specifically to encourage children to exercise more. The basic premise being that Spider-Man recruits these two random 10-year-old boys, as well as you, the audience, to work out. And working out specifically because the three of you are potential candidates for becoming Spider-Man. The theming for the Spider-Man Training Studio was definitely based off of the animated 90s series. I believe it had the same voice actor for Spider-Man, but just like in live action, dude with a suit. And in a lot of like the big transitions from like one thing to the next, it has clips from the series, so yeah. And also, let me not pass by the fact that it was definitely made in like the late 90s, early 2000s because it had that super totally rad and tubular child acting and color grading that is hard to find outside of like those early 2000s Power Ranger shows. It's very reminiscent of its time, and while the acting may not be perfect, while, you know, some may call it cheesy or corny, it was an exercise video geared towards getting children to exercise with Spider-Man, which I can hardly find anything wrong about that. It's just a quirky little exercise video to get kids on their feet and off the couch. So, hey, why not? Okay, now this is the part of the video where we have to talk about 9/11, because way back when, in the year 2001, Spider-Man came out. It came out late, very late in the year, and it came out late, very late in the year, and it came out after September. But the problem was that the promotional materials, like the teaser trailer, posters, all that kind of stuff, had released the summer before. And in the wake of the attack on the Twin Towers, the film's marketing team had to essentially pull all of that promotional material back. Because if you're talking about Spider-Man, when it comes to like posters and trailers and stuff like that, you're most likely going to get a shot of like the New York City skyline, which they did, except after September 2001, it was the wrong skyline. It was outdated. To put it gently, it was outdated after September. So they had to pull everything back. They had to, I wrote down the word retool the marketing and release the new teaser trailer in November. Oh my god, I was wrong. It released in May of 2002. Why did I think it was 2001? Maybe it was like announced in 2001, something like that? I don't know. I still wasn't alive at that point. But yeah, either way, it came out after the fact, and the promotional material came out before the fact, so there was a bit of a scramble, to say the least. Spider-Man 2 Enter Electro was the sequel to the PlayStation 1's Spider-Man game, and it was initially scheduled to release on September 18th, 2001, but had to be delayed due to 9/11. They had to do this because the entire final stage of the game, I have to adjust the lighting again. Get out of my chair. They had to reschedule because the entire final stage of the game was straight up just the Twin Towers. It was the World Trade Center. The entire final act of the game took place on the World Trade Center, and assuming that it was like a big, dramatic, electrifying kind of final battle, maybe having a game with explosions in the Twin Towers was not in good taste at that time. They had to completely recreate or like modify the entire final stage to not be the Twin Towers. They also cut out any mentions of the Twin Towers, whether it be in like writing or in audio. And for a while, pre-9/11 copies of Enter Electro were sought after as lost media. Because keep in mind, this was back before digital copies of games even existed. So obviously they had like physical copies, whether it be discs or cartridges. I can't remember what the PlayStation used. Had to be discs, right? I'm not looking it up. But they needed physical copies for promotional reasons, whether it be for like conventions or E3 if that was a thing in 2001, or just to test to make sure that the game actually runs on a disc, or is like the copies work. And especially considering that the attack happened a week before the game was supposed to release, there absolutely had to be some physical copies that were ready for distribution. But for the longest time, nobody could find an actual verified copy of Enter Electro before all of the post 9/11 reworks. Luckily for internet historians, this would eventually be found. I think a couple of people actually found different physical, and these were verified, and I'm pretty sure, and these were verified, and they maybe got digitized, so like there were digital copies now, like on the internet, who knows. But what is known is that it used to be lost media, but now it's not, and this instance of lost media was directly caused by editing that needed to be done because of 9/11. Speaking of video games, Spider-Man Classic was the cancelled sequel to Spider-Man Web of Shadows. In the game, you as Spider-Man would team up with Wolverine to, amongst also fighting new villains, also go through all the classic iconic spider clashes throughout Spider-Man's mythos, his entire story in the comics, with panel by panel faithfulness to the original comics. And it was only cancelled due to the fact that Shaba Games closed its doors in 2009, leading to, of course, all its current projects being cancelled or terminated. And while we didn't ever get Spider-Man Classic, of course, it was replaced somehow, I'm not sure if that's the right word, with Shattered Dimensions, which Shattered Dimensions is, of course, a Spider-Man game where, you play as various different Spider-Men from different dimensions. It had the classic red and blue, it also had Spider-Man Noir and Spider-Man 2099, which I think were both, for both those characters, were my first exposure to them, which I think is pretty cool. And people do consider it to be an indirect sequel to Web of Shadows. So even if the actual sequel, Spider-Man Classic, didn't exist, it spiritually still perseveres as the indirect sequel, Shattered Dimensions. Spider-Man fights Powdered Toast Man in the Ren and Stimpy crossover comic. There really isn't anything more than that. Now we here on the channel love a good fan theory, but also I'm bad at speaking, so let's see if I can actually communicate this theory properly. So the main tagline is Spider Sense draws Peter to danger. And from the research that I did, I think what it means is, I wrote Pete uses danger sense to seek out danger. So if the spider sense is a means of detecting threats, of detecting hazards around the person, the instinctual idea is you use that to run away from danger. Like if you're just a person who sees a threat, you identify a threat, you run away from that threat. But what I think this theory means is that Peter would kind of use it in the opposite sense, where like he would swing around, he would go on patrols and all that kind of stuff, and just kind of let the radar guide him towards danger. Because in this context, danger would mean crime. Danger would mean, bad people doing bad things, and Spider Man wants to stop that. So instead of running away from danger, as would maybe be the biological, like evolutionary. So, what would be like the evolutionary instinct to run away, Peter kind of fights against and uses this sense for the exact opposite to actually pick fights and find fights to pick. Or maybe it's entirely different. That's the fun thing about fan theories is even if you read out the original text verbatim, maybe you have a different understanding of it. In Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 1, the first one, there was a sincere effort to get Hugh Jackman to make a cameo appearance as Wolverine. And this idea only fell through because they couldn't find his suit. Now here's my thoughts on it. I know that there might be people out there that are thinking like, oh, that'd be a horrible idea. It's like you're not even taking the movie seriously or the continuity seriously. But the thing about that is nobody was taking superhero movies seriously back then. Everybody was just having fun. Maybe things were connected, maybe things weren't. It didn't matter. You just had fun with the thing because they're superhero movies. They're silly. You can do whatever you want. This isn't going to, I don't know, be like the foundation, like the compost ground for the most pivotal, overarching multiversal franchise. I personally think it would have been hilarious. It would have been cool. It would have been great, especially like early days Wolverine, like that, especially since in the comics Wolverine and Spider-Man are like one of like the big funky bunches when it comes to Spider-Man team ups. It also would have established the X-Men do exist in the Raimi verse, and so does Doctor Strange. That was something from a previous Iceberg video in case you didn't see it. But yeah, my opinions are it would have been fun, and don't take movies too seriously, I guess. And since we just talked about fan theories, let's actually talk about the other fan theory topic, which is Kindred is the original Peter Parker. So for those of you who don't know new developments in Spider-Man comics like me, Kindred was a character that was introduced, definitely an Amazing Spider-Man, that's like the main storyline one, but he was like a sort of demonic villain figure who was very dead set, like had a personal grudge against Spider-Man, which, to be fair, would not be the first demon that hated Spider-Man's guts. But the big thing about it was that people knew that Kindred was not like the original identity of Kindred. He came from somewhere, but the big mystery was who is Kindred? And the thing about Kindred is that he did have a true identity outside of just Kindred, and that became a huge mystery for all the Spider-Man fans, with a lot of fans coming up with their own theories. With one theory from Reddit user Ultimate Cardas, that's what I have written down. So this could be in reference to Peter selling a part of his soul, or like making a deal with Mephisto at the end of One More Day, or it could be like, some other fragment that fell off of Peter in one way or another. A lot of stuff has happened in the comics. However, this theory was eventually debunked as Harry Osborn was eventually confirmed to be Kindred. And that like fed into a thing of like all of Norman Osborn's success stemmed from like a deal with the devil. Again, a lot of stuff has happened in the comics, and it's been a while since I looked into this particular topic, so I could be wrong. I most likely am wrong, and that's okay. Same with this theory. It was wrong, but that's okay. Literature, and when it comes to fiction, theories do not need to be correct to be fun. This was still a fun idea. Was it canonically accurate? No, but it's still fun. So bravo, Ultimate Cardos, for your creativity. And I'd encourage you to exercise that creativity. Ooh, and speaking of characters, let's bring it back to the Vietnam War. Because Gordon Thomas, a Vietnam vet whose brother died, assumingly in Vietnam, and whose wife and child left him, was working at a company called Ace Signs until one George Finch bought the company and laid him off. And it's also here where it's important to point out that Gordon Thomas may not have been in the best mental state, seeing as how he was a Vietnam veteran who lost his brother and also had a wife and child leave him, probably because of the controversy of just being associated with the Vietnam War. So Gordon Thomas, justifiably in my opinion, has a mental breakdown and becomes Typeface, with his supersuit being, I don't remember what it looked like, what the suit itself looks like. I know the other thing, but I don't know what the looks like. Oh, that's cool. Okay, so Typeface, like his conventional outfit is no outfit. It's just like a military harness with cargo pants, camo pants, and all that stuff. But his face and sometimes his body is just covered in letters, with the most prominent letter like on his face being a big scarlet A, which at least in the original or like in the early stories of Typeface, uh, this A and maybe other letters on his face were drawn on using grease pencil or grease markers. And once he became Typeface, he was out for revenge. He planned on blowing up Finch, but had a change of heart. But Finch found the bombs and blew himself up and the building just to try to kill Thomas because I guess reasons, rich guy reasons, who knows? However, not only would Gordon Thomas survive, but also Typeface would end up going from villain to vigilante. And he would also end up leading an anti-registration group during the Civil War storyline in Marvel Comics. But you also might be wondering, hey, what does that have to do with Spider-Man? Which, hey, that is a fair question. That is because he initially started off as a Spider-Man villain, and also, just looking up his costume, I completely forgot, he also made an appearance in Across the Spider-Verse. With his oh-so-famous line, "Go to Helvetica." I love a good pun. And last, and in my opinion least, Trouble. Marvel's Trouble was a 5-issue Marvel romance comic. Pause right there. A Marvel romance comic featuring Aunt May, Uncle Ben, Mary, and Richard Parker as teenagers. Alright, now to be clear, romance comics are not necessarily like an unheard of thing. More specifically, before the Comics Code came and like put like, water wings on comic books, it was the Wild West. And a lot of them were either romantic or erotic comics. So that right there, like in a vacuum, romance comics are not necessarily like new or anything like that. How do I explain this like it's like gossip from people I knew in high school? So Mary and May are like best friends, been best friends forever. They start working at the same they start working the same summer gig at this golf resort. And they also meet up with brothers Ben and Richard Parker. However, this is like the jazz age or whatever. Like these are teenagers from what we see as elderly people later on. So, however, they are calling him Richie at this point to really emphasize the fact that this is quite some time ago. So they're all working at the same resort. And then on one weekend, May and Mary go out dancing, which is like the jazz age era of saying hard drinking. They are going clubbing. They are going to the club, and they are getting smashed. And for May, it's in more than one way, because they get back to the resort after dancing, and then May spends the night with good old Ben. And Mary also meets Richie in his room. However, they don't have sex because Mary got like a palm reading from a fortune teller who told her that if she had sex before she turned 18, that she would get pregnant, which, kind of playing the odds on that one, ain't you, fortune teller? So Mary is very hesitant to have sex, just in general. Like, she just wants to get to know Richie more, which is totally fine. And fortunately, Richard is not an absolute monster, and he says, that's fine. I'm not gonna pressure you into doing anything you don't want to do. But he is still an asshole because of what he does next. Because while May did get a fortune from that same fortune teller, her fortune, which is a far more ominous one, was simply that no one would ever call her mother. Just weird, just going from like, hey, practice safe sex, to you will never have a child. So May is far more like wild and free when it comes to her romantic endeavors, so she sleeps with Richie. Richie, Richard, Parker, the brother of Ben Parker, the dude you just got finished woohooing. So yeah, they boink. So yeah, Richard and May boink it, and they think like, oh, it's fine, nothing's gonna happen from this. Then May gets pregnant because it turns out that the fortune teller swapped the fortunes. So it was actually May who should have been the one being pretty careful about things. But, she was just like, oh, nobody's ever gonna call me mom. I'm 16 years old. I don't, if I have regrets about that, I'll wait till I'm 30. But May, in a full panic, is like, okay, this is bad, but it's not that bad. There's a good chance that it's Ben's kid. I slept with him first. Like, it wasn't just Richard that night. And even if, that's not the case, they're still brothers. The kid's still gonna look similar, right? So I'll just tell Ben, and maybe it'll be good news. Maybe, who knows? Only for her to tell Ben, and then for Ben to turn around and tell her that he's sterile. Why does a teenage boy know that he's sterile? Why is that needed information at that young? That's not like part of like a routine checkup. Who's checking the count for the? I don't want to get into it. Teenage romances just make me uncomfortable to begin with, because it's always like 40-year-old men who didn't have social lives in high school just writing their fantasies. Don't like it. So yeah, that happens, and then May has to run away from home because apparently she has very conservative parents and she's scared of them. So she's like a pregnant, homeless teenager at this point. But then she meets up with Mary again, who does say, hey, I'm still mad at you for, boinking the guy I liked. However, I don't want to see you like in a dangerous or like bad place, so I'm gonna help you out. And she comes up with a plan, and that plan is to just swap the baby. For May to carry the baby full term and then just give it to Mary. And then Mary and Richie, who she's planning on using this like baby swap thing as like a trust test for Richard, who at this point is like far away, has just been like sending letters to Mary. Letters that she's not been responding to, by the way. But she's like, hey, you know what I'm gonna do to like test the trust of this man before I really get serious with him? I'm gonna lie to him about something super serious. So yeah, Mary will get to have the baby, and then May will get to be able to like skirt heat off of, not get in trouble with her parents. And then also somehow eventually get back together with Ben. Oh my, by the way, the one of the many reasons why Trouble is so controversial was because it was kind of trying to be a retcon of a very particular story. Because take one wild guess as to what the name of this beautiful baby boy ended up being. If you guessed anything besides Peter, you are an idiot, because of course it was Peter. Some writer, some creative genius was trying to make it so that it was possibly canonically, true that Mary Parker was not the biological mother of Peter Parker. Instead, it was May. But it wasn't just, oh, Uncle Ben and May had a pregnancy that they weren't ready for, which is something that is, I personally have to believe, more common than this story. So they gave it to Richard and Mary Parker, who maybe they were the ones who were infertile and they wanted to have children, but they couldn't, and this was the closest thing they could do. So it would have been like the child of Ben and May Parker were initially raised by Richard and Mary, and then twist of fate came back to them. That would have still been odd. It would have been a huge like upset, but it would have made more sense. But no, it's, oh, Richard is still his father, but his Aunt May is his mother, and Uncle Ben's just like there, I guess. Oops. It's just so convoluted, and again, it's like the thing of like, why is this how you do it? Like, why is this like the story you want to make? And why does it have to be teenagers? Nothing of this story would have changed if these were just people they met in college. And with that, the 4th tier of the Spider-Man iceberg is complete. Thank you. Thank you all so much for watching to this point. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to hit that like button. If you want to see more of the iceberg in the future, or more videos either, thank you so much for watching to the end of this video. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like this video. If you'd like to see more of this kind of content in the future, including the next tiers of the Spider-Man iceberg. Feel free to subscribe. Hit that bell if you like bells. I don't. Is it still important? I can never remember if it's still important. But what is important is that, as always,